since I seen you. Countdown as the weeks trickle into days. I hope that time hasn't changed you. My happiness is slowly creeping back. Now you're at home.
Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which I meet with my virtual panel today, and I'd like to pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. Now, no doubt 2020 was a tough year, and one which I'm sure many of you were happy to see the back of, but it was also Australia's fourth warmest year and hottest spring on record, the year of a mass coral bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef, and a year when 8 Torres Strait Islanders known as the Torres Strait 8 had their human rights complaint against the Australian government backed by legal experts appointed by the UN, which supported their arguments that the Australian government's inaction on climate change was a breach of their human rights. As sea levels rise and the planets get hotter, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are already facing the reality of climate change. From huge tides flooding islands to changes in seasonal bush foods and altered water flows, for Indigenous Australians, this is not a future concern because it's already happening. It's estimated that over 470 million Indigenous people across 90 countries are there speaking more than 4,000 languages. But with many Indigenous people raising the current reality of what climate change is doing to their communities and their countries, why does it feel that no one is listening? To talk about the impact of climate change on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and their work in this space, I'm joined by Bradley Modgridge. Bradley is a proud Murray and Kamilaroi Nation man who has over 20 years' experience in Aboriginal engagement, water and environmental science. He also holds a Masters of Science, Hydrogeology and Groundwater Management from ACU. Tish King is a proud Zenad Kes, or Torres Strait Islander woman, with strong connections to Masig and Bardu. During and after her studies in ocean science at Griffith University, Tish has been actively involved in organising environmental groups across Australia and overseas. And Sasha Purcell Whaleboat is a Fulbright scholar and NYU human rights scholar in the climate change program. Sasha is a doctoral PhD researcher in Indigenous human rights, climate change and international law, and holds dual qualifications in law and international relations. And there is so much more that I could say about these three panellists because they have so much more expertise amongst them. But Bradley, I wanted to start with you. When, in terms of how you understand your connection to country, what is that? And I use country in a very broad term here because I realise that for some of us it can encompass a lot of different elements for Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And I suppose it's one of the questions you ask mob when you first connect with them. Who's your mob? Where you from? And I suppose that is a key part of country, that connection to a place. And for me, connection, Modgridge is an old English name, 1032 in Suffolk I can go back to in southern England. That's on my dad's side, but on my mum's side, Kamilaroi Nation, 45, 65,000 years. So that wins. That's why I identify and connect to that country because it's so old, and being part of that country is special. And I think I haven't grown up on country, so that connection is strong whenever I go back. And you sort of get over this range we go over and you think, I'm home. And I suppose that's what country is to me. Yeah. And family, of course. Yeah.
Of course. No, of course, Bradley. Tish, when you talk about, how your connection to country is for you, how do you understand that?
Thank you. I just want to share something quickly. Kulai kid nailak esa poiban. Namun kowe agat. Nun murazapu I mithen. Alak nal punka poiban. It's things like this, practicing language with my mother, that ensures me that I am able to stay connected. I too, like Brad, was never was raised on my island home and was always a proud Torres Strait Islander on mainland Australia. And so because of that disconnection always, I've had to find things to, make me feel grounded, connect to my other families, my saltwater families. And I've always just done that by being close to the ocean, everyone gets that, feeling, just what Brad said, it just feels different. You feel so connected. It's like that inner peace. And so for me, it's ensuring that I hold on to those moments, those experiences, and try and surround myself by that wherever I go.
And Sasha, hearing these two talk about how they describe their connection to country, I mean, how do you understand your connection?
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I as well as Tish, I'm a Torres Strait Islander who wasn't raised on my island of Mer Island. So I've maintained connection to culture, I guess, by practicing the spiritual, traditional practices and being one with nature and with the ocean. So again, living close to water is important to me, being surrounded by plants, going into the forests on the weekends, just maintaining that connection, and also maintaining my relationship with my family in the Torres Strait, in the community. And I find a lot of joy from singing. So a lot of spiritual singing, a lot of dancing involved as well, to keep those connections alive when you're not actually physically in the place. But once you get to the island, everything changes and you just feel like you're home and that you belong there. And that's because we do belong on those lands and those oceans that unfortunately we weren't able to be raised on.
And Sasha, I mean, having heard, how you have that connection and how you understand that connection to country to be, I wonder, what are those stories that you were told growing up that helped in understanding what that connection was? And also, I mean, as Torres Strait Islanders, we talk about that bloodline connection to islands too. It's in our blood.
There's a lot of stories that my family have shared with me, but one that's been very interesting that an elder told me recently. So my family is the whaleboat family. And when I was little, I went to a school excursion and there was a whale in the museum and it started making whale noises. And I started crying. And my mother, who was an Indigenous, didn't know what was going on. And we called my father and he explained that the whale is her totem, and the sound of a distressed animal, which is what the sounds were making her cry. And he said it's in her blood, it's in her soul, it's a part of her DNA. So now we know that I need to avoid whale noises because it is literally heartbreaking for me. So it's those kinds of stories that just make me feel connected to my ancestry as well. So it's always with me wherever I go.
Bradley, as a Kamilaroi man, I'm sure there were things that you heard growing up in terms of, kind of in terms of Kamilaroi, what that connection is with country too, and how that feeds into how you understand it.
Yeah, definitely. Similar, I had an experience where I was talking to some elders when I was researching my groundwater thesis, and I had this sort of vision of 3 water holes that I end up painting them. And once I explained it to the elder, that those 3 water holes I'd never been to, but they were connected to groundwater and they were very significant water holes, and they were stop-off places. Some were stop-off places and they were part of dreaming tracks. And I suppose turning that from a dream, let's say, to actually putting it on canvas and then getting it validated by the elders as something, it's part of your country, it's part of your story. And, I suppose that connection with water, that's why I'm in the game of water, and I think that's really strong. Yeah.
Tish, again, something that Bradley touched on, dreams, which is definitely something that happens in Torres Strait culture as well, in terms of how things are sent to you or messages that are sent to you. What did you learn when you were growing up, that helped you understand this connection and maybe that dream connection as well?
Yeah, no, so I'm not too sure for either Sasha or Brad, but because I was, disconnected from my native island, it was really hard for me to navigate and understand that connection because I was trying to connect to the community and the country I was on. And learning more about, First Nation culture there. But then, it was, torn between, am I forgetting who I am? So it wasn't through those sort of, years of learning did I really find to understand how I can have that connection. So I kind of started a little bit late to the game with hearing a little bit about old people's stories, but, it's something that has now enabled me to connect and create relationships, outside of, the relationship between your safety net of your family. I've got my own personal relationships with my family now on the outer islands and just really appreciate the time that they've been able to help me, on my journey. It's been really great.
And just quickly on that journey, Tish, you recently went back to Masig. What was that for you, being able to go back and understand what that connection and what that bloodline is?
I think exactly the way that Brad just mentioned it before, something just pulls you in. You feel so connected and really grounded. Like I got off the plane, that small plane, and you come in and there's a beautiful, Dari over the airport. And then, an uncle said, who you belong to? And you just say your name and they're like, come on, daughter, I take you now. And it just made me feel like I was home. And he said, welcome home. And that emotion just felt like I never belonged anywhere. And it felt really really emotional experience.
Bradley, I want to get into a little bit, you talked about your work just before and having that dream about the 3 water holes. And so I want to know, what is Indigenous water science?
Well, how long we got? It's the way I see it. It's we're the oldest living culture on the planet. We're on the driest inhabited continent on Earth, yet we don't have a say in water per se. We don't have a say in water ownership. We don't own water as much as we should in current markets and also under legislation. We were behind the 8 ball from day one. All our mob was on missions and reserves. And when all the land and water was given away, and once we were counted as humans in 1967 and emerged from those missions and reserves, all the good land and water was gone. So for me, building that, it's more about being a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait. Well, I can't talk for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but I want to be a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when I'm the only one in the room. You find that so much that you'll be sitting there surrounded by people that have a presumption that you probably don't know, but then you start rattling off what you've done, and that Indigenous science comes through. And I think part of that is making our knowledge, moving it from the realm of make-believe, mumbo-jumbo, myth and legend to science. Our mob was doing science before science was even a thing. So we were testing country, we were testing the environment, we were testing plants and animals, bush foods, bush medicines, all that is a science, and I think there's a methodology there. It's linked in with stories and songs. There's results and there's replication because we're still here.
Well, Bradley, on that, how has this science and these knowledges, how is that being used in Australia when we talk about Indigenous water science?
The challenge with science, it is a tough nut to crack, and the culture of science needs to change and obviously allow these knowledge systems, this old knowledge system, come into the realm of a modern world, and how we can actually find commonalities between Western science and traditional knowledge, and how we can actually manage country for the betterment of country, because, the last 233 years hasn't been that flash. And I suppose one of the things we need to look at is, do we need a 233-year recovery plan for this continent? Because it's been abused beyond doubt. It has, especially in the water space. I don't know if people saw the the floating Murray cod and yellowbelly in the lower Darling River in the Murray-Darling Basin, and those fish are people's totems, and the stories they have and the connections they have to those fish weren't seen as a science, because there was two independent science panels created, one by the government and one by the opposition at federal level. Not one Indigenous person was seen as an expert for those panels. And, that's the sort of culture that needs to shift. And, there's evidence that we can provide. I might get into a bit later when we start talking about sea level rise and ice ages and knowledge and validation. And so, yeah, there's plenty to chat about that. But I think Indigenous science, we just need to make sure that we're building evidence in this space and providing traditional knowledge a platform, and it's seen as an equal to Western science. That's my aim.
So ultimately, Bradley, you'd like to see it being used more than it is currently?
Oh, definitely, yeah. It's well below its impact level, that's for sure, yeah.
Sasha, you recently presented as an expert panellist at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues on climate change, particularly in the Torres Strait. What were the recommendations that you gave to that forum?
Yes. So in relation to this, so I've been speaking at the United Nations independently as a Torres Strait Islander lawyer or as a delegate for a UN mechanism in relation to climate change for a few years. This year, I presented as an expert panelist at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on climate change. So my specific recommendations were, and I will read them out to you, that the United Nations Permanent Forum urged the Australian government to consult in the Torres Strait Islands with leaders of the Torres Strait about climate change, recognise the value of traditional ecological knowledge, which is what Brad is discussing, as an authority for truth of how to act to find solutions to these problems. So if I flesh that out a bit in relation to legal avenues, urge the Australian government to recognise climate change's impacts on the life, culture and right to self-determination, and to act on that advice provided by Torres Strait Islander people. Urge the Australian government to recognise that the land, seas and natural resources are owned by the Torres Strait Islanders and remain retained by the traditional landowners. Urge the Australian government to commit to ongoing appropriate funding for emergency seawalls with a focus on sustained investment as requested by the local community leaders. Urge the Australian government to make policy and take concrete action to meet its low emission reduction target of 26 to 28% by 2030. And I emphasize that, to make policy. And urge the Australian government to assist the Torres Strait Islands financially for the foreseeable future to repair and build infrastructure to withstand the ravages of incremental climate change. And finally, that the Australian federal government acknowledge that they are responsible for the Torres Strait Islands, what happens to them in relation to climate change, and that displacement is not an option.
So, Sasha, I mean, now that you've presented that, and I mean, you have been very much an international voice. You are in a line of a lot of Torres Strait Islanders that have had that voice internationally to the UN, and I probably should acknowledge the work here of Auntie McRose Ilu, all her work in the late 70s, the 80s, parts of the 90s, and the work that she's done as someone from Saibai who was forced, that community was forced off their islands, which is how we come to have these communities on the tip of Cape York of Bamaga and Sasia. So it's a history that they know of and a history that they're facing down once more. But I mean, how visible do you think climate change, and what is happening in the Torres Strait is to those outside?
I mean, the first issue is, what is the visibility of Torres Strait Islands? A lot of people don't know we exist. So, I always refer to us as a minority within a minority, and that term, I think, that phrase has been picked up quite a lot now. So the first issue is letting people know we exist and that we're here. The second issue is in relation to visibility of climate change in the Torres Strait in the Australian context, so the domestic level in relation to law and legislation and policy. So there is very limited visibility. We are often grouped in with the Aboriginal population in relation to research, data, rhetoric, and dialogue. And so there's really very little visibility about the individuality of Torres Strait Islander people, their community, their climate, and those specific issues that they face. If we look at the international level in relation to the legal aspect, it's actually a little bit better, because Indigenous populations from throughout the world, from South America, from European countries, from Southeast Asia, from Africa, every continent have come together at mechanisms at the UN to speak about these concerns. So there is actually more visibility, I believe, at the international level in some ways, because I have an ability to have a voice there. I still don't feel like I have the ability to have a voice at the domestic level. So I do advocate at both spaces, but the visibility is very low. And I make the point of, for example, I'm in New York right now, researching and undertaking my Master's of Law. And when I speak to people, they don't know that we exist. They have never heard of us before. Some people don't know that Australia has an Indigenous population at all. So I make it a point to educate people about who I am, where I come from, who our people are, what the history is, the real history of Australia, and to, I guess, bring that visibility to light. Because once you have visibility, you have confrontation or you have accountability. And essentially, it's about bringing accountability and justice to an injustice that's occurred in the Torres Strait Islands. So very limited visibility, but I'm trying to improve that.
Tish, I'll come to you because your head was nodding furiously during that. You had your little snaps going on there. But obviously something that you're also passionate about, because Masig is one of those islands that is being affected by rising sea levels at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And exactly right. I think Sasha really sort of, hit the nail on the head with a lot of points about, like Torres Strait Islander people being a minority within a minority. But yes, right now, it's monsoonal season in the top end of Australia. So remote communities, are being, hit already from, cyclones and heavy rainfall, as well as, king tides and erosion. And, some of our islands up there, like Boigu and Masig, have had, it's flooding on Boigu Island right now. People are walking around the streets in water. In Masig, Bala Yese, who a few of you all connected with, he sent some pics and said there's been a metre off the beach. And, this is how, what needs to happen for the government to see what is wrong here in the picture. It's just really incredible, the disparities and the injustices, and there needs to be a lot that needs to change.
Well, Tish, I might come to, what SEED does. I mean, can you tell me what SEED is and the work that you do with young people?
Yeah, so for those who actually don't know who Seed Mob are, we are Australia's first Indigenous youth climate network. And since 2014, we've been building the capacity of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people to care, connect to country, and look at, the impacts of climate change and the exacerbation by fossil fuel industries.
And so, Tish, what do you think, why is it important that SEED, is there for young Indigenous people to get involved in? I mean, why is that voice, do you think, needed?
So I guess, all of us in here in this conversation obviously are in the climate space. And so I guess for those who have been analysing climate activism, this is an important move towards a politicised generation that actually understands climate change is the greatest threat to our collective future. But we also know it's an opportunity to create a more and just sustainable world. So, as Brad said, we've been here. We are the longest surviving culture, in the world, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are at the forefront of climate change. And as young people, it's our generation with the most at stake. It's our communities on the front lines who need to be at the forefront of change, leading these solutions and building a society that is healthier and cleaner, more just, and puts people before profits, dirty profits. It is to ensure our future and for future generations so that we can continue to survive as the oldest living culture in the world. Our old people have been fighting this for decades. It's now our turn to do it so that we can, share the stories and pass them down to the next generation. It is young mob that could play a crucial role in, combating climate change. Our young mob who can, be adept at spreading new habits and technologies. Our young mob, who are adaptable and can quickly make low carbon lifestyles and career choices as part of their daily lives. We're seeing it already. I really think that, they are the future and can really make a difference.
Bradley, I want to dig more into the work that you've been doing, particularly around water. And I want to get a better understanding of, from your Kamilaroi point of view, but also the work that you've done in this, of what Aboriginal people's relationship is with groundwater.
Yeah, groundwater, for people that may not know, some people do, some people don't. Yeah, it's the water that, when it rains, water soaks in and then it moves through the layers of the earth, and it'll find itself in a porous rock, and it'll move between that rock. And I suppose that's the water that sits under the ground. And, we have the biggest inland aquifer, I think, on the planet, the Great Artesian Basin, So my country is towards the bottom of the basin, so we have a lot of springs. There are some recharge areas, and some of those recharge areas are under threat. And I suppose our knowledge of this dry continent, if you don't have any rivers flowing, you have to know groundwater. And I suppose when you look at this country, it's 70% arid at the mainland Australia, 70% arid. So if you don't know where to find or re-find water, if it's not in your songs, if it's not in your dances, you're not going to last long in this country. And I think, and when the settlers came, they just, in the Great Artesian Basin, there was great pressure, a great amount of pressure in the aquifer, and they just had to dig a well, and this beautiful water come out. And they thought, what's this? And so a lot of them went untapped for 150 years. And then so what happened, a lot of these springs that our old people connected with that had dreaming stories and placed song lines along, they were starting to dry up. So, and, you'll find when I did my research that, the rainbow serpent type cultural hero was very strong in a lot of the stories. And suppose the rainbow serpent would move between the surface and the underground and use the springs as portals, and it come up on the surface and do its thing and create rivers and mountains, and then it'd go back into, and then if you messed with, under law, LORE, if you messed with those groundwater systems, that wasn't a good thing if you're a member of a family group or a tribe, because, it's either the impact you had was meaning that the snake had either died or moved on, and because that spring had dried up. And so what we've seen is that groundwater knowledge is not really perceived as a science, So a lot of our mobs, connect with groundwater. I heard a really cool story in Catherine. There was an old man talking about his connection, and he had the Northern Territory water controller, who was the departmental guy, and they're talking about his connection to country, and he talks about 3 different types of water at their hot springs. So that's hot spring country as well. And he's talking about red water, white water, black water, but it was all related to soil and geology, but he said they're all connected. And when he started telling the department about that, they said, "You're dreaming, old man. That can't be true." And so they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars drilling, and guess what they found? They're all connected. So this old man knew his country like the back of his hand, and also his groundwater systems. And I think that sort of knowledge just doesn't play a part in the way we manage water. And I think that's part of my challenge, is to bring that knowledge to the forefront and obviously celebrate it.
And Bradley, that's also the reason why I've been asking you the difference between science and knowledges and categorising them like that, because I know that even though they can work together, they're viewed as very different things. But if we continue on with Aboriginal people's relationship with groundwater, how do you see non-Indigenous Australia's relationship with the Great Artesian Basin, which, as you said, is one of the world's largest freshwater resources?
Yeah, I think it's, when we think about that sort of water, there's a value aspect to it. So our mob value it like it's the essence of life. Without it, you die. It's simple as that. And unfortunately, there are perceptions of that water. It's out of sight, out of mind. You don't see it, but you drill a hole and water comes out magically. And I think our old people knew the importance of this groundwater, whether it was shallow or deep, and the springs that was, providing this in a dry landscape, you're seeing this beautiful water come out of the ground, and it was highly protected. And there are some of these places that under law certain people can't go to, and there are ceremonies a part of that. And then when you look at all the springs in the dry country, in the desert, there's high amounts of Aboriginal occupation and evidence around these places. So these would have been a hive of activity. There would have been marriages done and trade done, and sharing of stories, tribal business done. So these places are highly significant for our people, and I think that bit isn't really known by non-Indigenous people, and I think that's the bit that we celebrate. It's the celebration of that is the key part. It's not myth and legend, as I said before, or that fable stories that were collected back in the day. This is thousands of generations of observation of one's country. That's what it is, and I think that bit, if we can celebrate that, and that can form part of policy and legislation, that it's being considered, validated, and implemented in the way we manage water, I think country would be a better place.
Going from water now back to rising seas, Sasha, your PhD is looking at climate change in the Torres Strait, but what is the main focus of that work? What is that work that you're doing?
So my PhD is twofold, essentially. The first part of it is qualitative research, so speaking with members of the Torres Strait community about how incremental climate change is impacting their economic and social and cultural rights, and their ability to access those basic human rights that are fundamental to everybody. The second part of my PhD is to look at international legal mechanisms and other legal avenues for us to advance and give voice to our concerns about breaches of human rights in the Torres Strait regarding climate change. So I will be in the community for several years, speaking with many different people of the community about how climate change is impacting their lives. So have they lost housing due to sea level rise? Have sacred burial sites been washed away? I mean, the answer to all of these questions is yes, I know they are. But it impacts your mental health and your physical health, because there are limited resources in the Torres Strait, and there's limited infrastructure. So if you're cut off from postal services delivering food, and your coral reefs are destroyed, and there are less turtles and there are less ocean animals to consume, then obviously that's going to be a stressor on a family. And stressors in an environment such as that, in a small isolated community, can lead to many other problems. So it's about establishing the fundamental basic human rights, what has been breached, and getting that through a narrative storytelling methodology. But it's also evidence for future lawsuits. And the second part is for me to then apply that to potential avenues. So should I potentially advocate for a treaty or for autonomy for Torres Strait Islanders? Should I start looking at native title? Should we do another lawsuit with the UN in relation to another avenue that a legal avenue that I can persuade? That's my goal. So it's twofold: is to have the PhD, but also be able to advocate as a lawyer in that space. And finally, it's going to be a record of stories and knowledge from people. So it will be one of the most, I guess, rare pieces of a PhD where it's interviewing Torres Strait Islanders about Torres Strait Islander issues by a Torres Strait Islander, and then going to be published and produced for the world to see what the Torres Strait Islanders are about. They're about persevering in the face of adversity. They're about strength and character and coming together as one in a community. They're about a people who have survived through so many struggles and have overcome so many things and are still advancing to this day, even though they are losing their literal houses and land. So that's essentially what the PhD is about. It's not just a PhD, it's about a bigger thing. It's an arc in a story about making sure that saltwater people like us, we don't disappear.
Sasha, just on that, I mean, in the research that you have been doing, I mean, what are you seeing internationally as well of how climate change is affecting other Indigenous communities?
I mean, internationally, climate change is disproportionately affecting Indigenous populations. So we are the most affected population in the world, yet we contribute the least to the causes of climate change. So if you look at that, that's an incredible injustice. In relation to international bodies who've been affected, it's the same kind of issues. You're looking at Tuvalu and Kiribati losing their land to the water. You're looking at the Solomon Islands, which has the same issues. And then if you look at continents, the African continent, we're talking about, lacking, the water is disappearing. So people having to travel further just to get water, and then having to travel back a longer distance at night, which is risky because there are animals and there are other issues in relation to safety. So it kind of really accumulates into something that it's just all encompassing and affects every single individual person within the Indigenous population. And I've spoken with individuals throughout the world, and South America, especially one area that it's definitely been affected. And it's interesting to see that Australia is doing quite well in relation to finally having legal entity recognized for rivers and for water. And Native Americans are pushing that in relation to their forests and their trees. And New Zealand just had a case that came out, and they've had, I believe, a river recognized as well. So these are the important things where Indigenous people come together at the UN and in the international space where we can learn from each other. But unfortunately, the sad part is that it is affecting all Indigenous populations because we live in rural and remote areas most of the time. We do that because it's where we're from and where we belong. And even if it's not, even if you're living in the city, if you're still Indigenous, you're still connected to that land ancestrally and culturally. That's a part of who you are. So any impact to your birthright and your ancestral home is going to impact you.
Bradley, are you seeing the same thing? You were nodding a lot, particularly where Sasha was talking about water. And I mean, internationally, are those the conversations that you're having with your Indigenous counterparts?
Yeah, look, I feel sorry for the people of the Torres Strait because, they're going to be climate refugees in their own country. And, that's really sad. And those sort of issues aren't front page. Why not? And I think that's the challenge of, you just mentioned the exposure. That sort of exposure needs to be front page. And why is it happening? Because those challenges are going to be more and more. And on my country, it's getting drier and hotter, and the rivers are drying up quickly. But then you've got the challenge of, well, let's say mismanagement of that water resource. It's over allocated, the whole basin. The basin's 1 million square kilometres, the Murray-Darling. It's over allocated. So they gave away too much water back in the day, and now they're trying to claw it back to a number. But really that number that they've set isn't high enough. And, there is science behind that. And I think that the challenge is for us is that we don't really have a say in that. They look at our values and they think, oh, well, Aboriginal people, they'll just engage with water. They won't extract it for any good. That's wasted water. That's what's perceived. And I think as we come out of the millennium drought, and then we went straight, there was a small rain event, and we went straight into another drought. And, I don't know what it's called, a mega drought or something. So, the Bureau of Meteorology might need to have a naming nomenclature for droughts because they're going to be more and more like they do for cyclones. Jerry the drought, Tom the drought, Mary the drought, So is that our reality? These droughts are going to come harder and hotter, and we're going to see these impacts. But one thing that happened in the millennium drought in the basin non-Aboriginal populations went down. So there was a lot of families were selling up their farms and their water entitlements, but the Aboriginal population went up. So people were going back to country because country was sick. And I think that's the other bit that we need to, I suppose, expose is that, a lot of our mobs are going home because they know country's sick. All the indicators are there. And that's part of that science and understanding of country is that a lot of the indicators are saying that, country is not healthy. The plants are flowering at different times. The insects are turning up at different times. The water's coming at a different time. So all these things are based around climate change impacts. And I think the aspect of mental health is another big one. And when you look at mental health, because, when you don't have access to clean, healthy water, you're going to drink sugar drinks. And, then you've got the other health impact to kick into that, So what would you rather drink, warm, salty groundwater or a cold can of some soft drink, And that's what our young ones do, yeah.
If I can comment what Brad was saying, absolutely, there are 2 points that I'm so glad he mentioned. So the mental health one is a real concern. So if you're in a stressful situation and it's exacerbated by climate change and you have limited resources to help yourself and help your community, that's going to increase your stress, which is going to impact your mental health. If you have limited access to healthy food and water, that's going to impact your physical health. This all relates to right to health, right to culture. So these are fundamental human rights. In relation to his other point in relation to water. So we have seen a change in the Torres Strait of the seas and the oceans and the tides, and also the winds that come and also the plants that are being produced. So there is what we call it's essentially like a calendar that predicts when we should be farming and harvesting and gardening and, fishing and not fishing to make sure that we, don't deplete the resources. It's no longer accurate because of climate change. And in relation to this, he's absolutely right. Torres Strait Islanders are potentially going to become refugees in our own country. And the thing is, we can't change climate that fast. So climate is just a bigger picture of what weather looks like. But what we can do is have more resources given to us to fight these issues. So it's not like there is just no plan and that there's nothing to be done and that we should just give up. It's a matter of the Australian government providing the resources, and I say financially and economically, that we need to help our communities.
Tish, I'm going to come to you in terms of when we were talking about sort of just that international focus and what you're hearing from international groups. I mean, SEED does a lot of online conversations, and you recently had one with the Pacific Climate Network. I mean, what did you learn from the work that they're doing?
Yeah, best thing with SEED is that since 2014, since it came about, we've been really building connections with other Indigenous and First Nations people across the world. And we're really connected to the Pacific Climate Warriors, who too are going through the same crisis that the Torres Straits are. And, Sasha just, mentioned before about Kiribati, and the severity of their situation is the same thing. They're in the same fight. And, what I love about their message is that they're not drowning, they're rising. And so it's the same thing, like, upon reflection and hearing what Brad and Sasha are saying, it's that deeper connection to country. That's the mental health. We don't want to be disconnected anymore. It's about, bridging, our science to Western science and, moving forward together. And, they're doing the same thing. Their messages are the same, but in their own languages and in their own ways. And it's just really beautiful to be able to go on this journey with other First Nations people across this world. And just like what Sasha said, her being able to, elevate our voices here in Australia really helps, shed awareness about this, the social injustices still and, and challenges that we have in our systems.
Bradley, what is the biggest challenge for you in your work that you think needs to be overcome in order for there to be better water management?
Oh, as I said earlier, how long we got? Oh, talk for days. Oh, it's huge. Yeah, where do I start with that one? Like that's a big question, and I think what we need is at all levels. We've got two deadly women here talking about Torres Strait connections, but also the rights of our mob. And I think if we're attacking at all levels, then we're going to get that exposure. And like the international level, but localized level. We does, and I think Indigenous scientists can play a part in that, and I suppose then the Indigenous lawyers can then start banging the table with evidence, and start pushing that. And I think science is a key part of that informing policy, and I think Indigenous knowledge can be a part of that, definitely. And I think what Sasha was saying about her PhD, it's what I've been trying to do in my PhD. I am doing a PhD as well, so part-time. And I'm getting close. COVID stopped me from submitting in June last year, but, I'm getting there because mine is similar. He's talking to our mob on country about water. What is water to them and when should it be here? The cultural indicators that determine water, and then, build towards that calendar that Sasha mentioned. I think they are great opportunities to build knowledge into a system to then actually deliver water at the right time, especially when we're talking about systems that are purely managed by levers in a dam. That's our reality. And I think if we can have a voice in that, build credible evidence, have the best available traditional science impacting and informing the way we manage country, then that'll be a better future, no doubt.
Sasha, for you, the biggest challenge that you see in the work that you're trying to do?
Oh, again, that is a loaded question. I guess there is a level of disrespect in some ways about the value of traditional ecological knowledge, which I'm sure Brad completely understands. So that's one of my concerns, is that I'm pushing forward in relation to being recognized as science, and my methodology in relation to storying to be recognized. But in relation to my advocacy, the biggest barriers I've found are that there are limited opportunities for me to advance Torres Strait Islander climate change issues in Australia, which is interesting. So that's why I've had to go internationally, because I just don't have the avenues or the opportunities to speak to the relevant people about what is happening in my community. So it's about access, I believe, and I believe it's also about respect. I think respect should be shown to the Torres Strait Islander people for what they're going through, what they're trying to achieve, and that the Australian government listens to them. And internationally, it's a little easier, I think, to actually advocate at that space, because people recognize the value and the justice of human rights and self-determination for Indigenous people. So those are the barriers that I face. And along with what Brad was saying, it's just a matter of ensuring that we use climate science as evidence. And once Brad and I should talk, because if he's got evidence, I can use it in a lawsuit. So that's the kind of relationship, and that's the kind of future that we need to have. We need to think strategically about what we can do for our communities.
I'm so glad I could facilitate that between the two of you in that sharing of knowledge as you were talking before. Yeah. Now, Tish, for you, I mean, what are the challenges going forward for SEED and the work that you do very much with grassroots communities?
Yeah, no, I also too love this connection. So great. On that, like, I guess you know, my biggest fear, and because we've been talking a lot around connection to country, is that if the Australian government continues supporting the expansion of fossil fuel industry with public funds, this country will not reach its goals for reducing, you know, carbon emissions by 2050. And, you know, communities like the Torres Strait, who are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change, will not have a future. We're talking about, you know, about nomenclature, about droughts, and that's exactly right. We're having more of like natural causes often and more intense. And if we do continue to exacerbate, you know, the earth warming, you know, our north and south poles will continue to melt. And it will raise our seas. And I really, honestly, am scared that my island home will be underwater in my lifetime. Our old stories before, you know, before the coming of light washed away. My totem's gone and my old people's bones washed away, like Sasha has said. And that recent trip to the Torres Straits on Mussig, I did see that. And it frightens me. And I just fear that, you know, we're talking about how we keep connected. I'm scared that I won't know who I am.
So is that then one of your biggest fears, Tish, is that you don't know who you are? I mean, when it comes to climate change, what is your biggest fear? Essentially that. I mean, that we just won't, you know, we won't be the longest, oldest surviving culture anymore because we won't be here. And, you know, it's, you know, that's a part of the challenge. You know, it's about, you know, we've all mentioned that we have to make that connection between, you know, Western science and our traditional science, and how we need to really shift, you know, people's hearts and minds of that. You know, I want to share the way that I feel and show them. And I think, you know, after the year that was 2020, here in Australia, everyone really took for granted the value of being outside. And then, you know, we're all about, I'm a nature lover and all of that sort of stuff. And it's like, okay, cool, but why aren't you helping advocating for it? Like, you know, isn't this an indicator that she's sick? You know, so we need, you know, that people power. And I think that's, you know, going back to our grassroots organizing, is that, you know, we need to really, that's the challenge, shifting people's hearts and minds to care about that. Because I know you care. It's like, buddy, I know you go surfing every day. Like, I know you love the ocean. Come on, like, come pick this rubbish up, or, you know, do all that sort of stuff. And that's just now the journey that we're on. And I think it's spaces like, you know, the conversation that we're having right now, having meaningful, critical conversations, being able to just be connected and know that we're not on this journey alone, is, a bit more rewarding. But no, that's probably one of our main challenges.
Tish, that is fantastic to hear. And I think I've just thought about it. So Australian government's retort to the Torres Strait 8 lawsuit was that this climate change is a future concern in the Torres Strait. And I spoke on this at a different event, and I had a stack of papers about this high, and I kind of just threw them and read them back to, like, these are the receipts, this is the evidence of the research that goes back into, you know, the early 70s of climate change impacts in the Torres Strait. This is not a future concern. This is a now concern. So if you combine Brad's climate science knowledge with your advocacy and your points about what's happening now in relation to rising sea levels on your island, there's your retort. There's your defense. Game over, Your Honor. No further questions. This is not a future concern. It's a past concern. Yeah. It's a now concern, and your argument is invalid.
Mm.
Bradley,
definitely.
Is there something that you're particularly worried about when it comes to climate change, in terms of like a biggest fear or even just a concern?
I think when I hear Tish's comments around, you know, that her country, but both of your countries will disappear, and what do you connect to then? What's left to connect to? And I think that's really scary. You know, if that doesn't scare people, I don't know what is. And, you know, as you've got, you know, rising sea, you've got saltwater intrusion on freshwater systems, you've got eroding country, you've got, you know, sadly, you mentioned the people that have passed before you are starting to be exhumed because of the water, you know. So that's really, really scary. That is a now issue. And for me, I think, we're going to see a lot more rivers drying up. We're going to see a lot more fish floating belly up on dry riverbeds. That is now. It's happening now. And I think the aspect of what also Tish said, I really connected with that, because my PhD as well is that I got tired of hearing people telling our stories. I want to tell stories my way, and I think that's the part of it too, is what we need to do is tell our stories our way, like the old people did, but also, we're walking in two different worlds, and when you talk to mob, it's a different discussion you're having. When you're talking to a science panel, it's a different discussion. When you're submitting journal papers, it's a different language. I would have loved to have written my PhD for my mum and family, but also for science. But I don't have enough time.
Well, Bradley, just wrapping up, I mean, what, I suppose, do you want non-Indigenous Australians to understand about our changing climate and its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders?
What do we want? Land rights. Look, I think it's the more we produce, and these two deadly women, the more they speak, the more and we get our elders to speak about the impacts of what we're seeing, and then the more evidence we build around this. A lot of our stories are in song and oral traditions and in dance. It's this generation now that can make that difference, to turn it into stories written by us, for us, that can have impact on climate change, but also the way we manage country. Like the ranger groups that are doing works on all over the country of Australia, they're making Australia look good for bugger all. But the evidence suggests that when we're working on country and caring for country, we're happier and healthier. Duh.
Duh.
Tish, for you, what do you want non-Indigenous Australians to understand about climate change and its effect right now on Indigenous peoples?
I think one thing to really say is that it's not change, it's a crisis. We're in a climate crisis, and it is this crisis is a symptom of deeper injustices. As young people, I just, as a young person, I'm concerned that we are already living in an incredibly unsustainable and unfair society with rising inequality and environmental destruction. At the root cause is a colonial system that puts the profits of big polluters over Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, land rights, the well-being of our communities and the environment. And upon reflection on this conversation, these feelings of both love and absence with the natural world are essential to understanding why we must protect it. And it's great to, I'm so inspired to be here with Sasha and Brad, who are really trying to do it, because I know we're not driven by money. We're driven because we want to help our people. We want to help our families. We do it for them. And it's essential for our survival and our collective. And when I say collective, everyone, not just, colored people in minorities, everyone. But we can't do it alone. And effective policy and systemic change is required here in our country, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people must have a seat at that table. It must be place-based, deliberative, and culturally safe. Our involvement must be sincere. And in order to achieve this, we need First Nations justice, and we must be able to lead, because, this extends out to, all of our respecting sacred sites and ensuring First Nations voices to Parliament, because it means reconciliation and it means treaty. But, we're at a crucial moment now, and we can do it all together for a just future for all.
And Sasha, what is your message to non-Indigenous Australia about the effect of climate change on Indigenous peoples?
I think I like to paint it in this picture. I'm going to be a lawyer about it. I would ask, do you like living in your house? Do you like feeling secure? Do you like having clean water that comes out of a tap? Do you like having the reliability of having access to nutritional food? Do you like the security of knowing that when you walk outside, you're not going to walk into water or have destruction of your house? Do you like the security of being able to have access to education for your children and medical services when there's a problem? Because everyone's going to say yes to that. And that's just basic common sense. And then I say, well, in the Torres Strait, climate change is affecting all of those things. Every single one of those things that you take for granted, that you think that you have a right to, is being challenged in the Torres Strait Islands because of climate change. So I don't see why you shouldn't be involved in this problem, in this issue, in solving it. You should be actively with your voice and with your decisions in relation to investments, etc., and talking to your local members of parliament, advocating for the rights of Torres Strait Islander people, because we will not be displaced. That is our homeland. It's a basic human right to live where your ancestral home is. So it's a matter for the Australian people to come together and realize this is everybody's problem. It's not just Indigenous people. We all have to pick up the fight and work together.
Well, on that note, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, but I do wish to thank you, Brad Modgridge, Sasha Purcell-Whaleboat and Tish King. Thank you so much. And thank you
for having me.
And thank you for joining us.
Eso yawo.
So, awasa.
It seems an age since I seen you. Countdown as the weeks trickle into days. I hope that time hasn't changed you.